Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear the name Salvador Dali, your brain immediately conjures two images.
Oh, absolutely.
That signature, gravity-defying waxed mustache, and those famously gooey melting pocket watches just draped over a deserted beach.
Right. He's the figurehead of Surrealism. I mean, his name is basically synonymous with the bizarre, the dreamlike, and yet also the meticulously, painstakingly crafted.
And that contrast, that tension right there, the meticulous technician versus the magnificent showman, that's really the foundation of this deep dive for you.
It is. Our mission here is to help you quickly but thoroughly navigate the sheer complexity of Dali's career. We want to move past the public eccentricity, the outrageous quotes, the stunts, the pet ocelot.
The anteater on a leaf.
The anteater, right.
Yeah.
You want to get past that to understand the profound depth of his actual artistic contribution.
So we are synthesizing sources that detail everything. His roots in, well, the intense cultural crucible of Catalonia, his explosive acceptance, and then, subsequent rejection by the Parisian surrealists.
Yeah. And his massive pivot to what he dramatically termed nuclear mysticism.
Yes, and his mastery across every medium imaginable: painting, sculpture, film, even high fashion.
The public Dali, the one who gives lectures in a deep-sea diving suit, was a calculated performance artist. But the sources reveal this foundational genius, just a jaw-dropping technical skill.
But he also seemed determined at times to undermine his own credibility through this relentless, almost aggressive quest for fame and fortune.
Exactly. And we have to address the controversies, the politics, the commercialism. We'll look at them impartially, but also try to understand how they shaped his legacy.
Before we jump into his childhood, let's start with a foundational piece of psychological context. Here's your initial aha moment that kind of cuts through all the noise.
Okay.
His full name was, and it's magnificent, Salvador Domingo Felipe Jacinto Dalí y Domènech. But the Salvador Dalí we all know was not the first Salvador Dalí in his family.
That's right. His older brother, also named Salvador, was born in 1901 and died of gastroenteritis just 9 months before the artist was born in 1904.
And this trauma, this idea of being a replacement, of living under the shadow of a predecessor who shared his name, it haunted Dalí for his entire life.
He didn't just acknowledge it. He, leaned into it. He mythologized it.
He famously said of his deceased brother that they resembled each other like two drops of water, but we had different reflections. Just think about that for a second. The idea of being a reflection, a second iteration, a distorted mirror image.
It's an incredibly powerful psychological concept, and you see it manifest later in his art. Most chillingly, I think, in the 1963 painting, Portrait of My Dead Brother.
That work is something else. It uses that pointillist technique to create a fragmented, almost molecular image of a Christ-like face.
And it shows just how deeply embedded this early trauma was in his subconscious iconography. So if you want to understand the man, you have to understand this duality, the sense of being the second and always seeking to justify his own existence through this radical creativity.
The man who would become Dalí was born and formed in Figures in the Catalan region of Spain. And his family life was really defined by massive contrasts that, well, they set the stage for his later rebellious behavior.
Definitely. His father, Salvador Dalí Cusi, was a strict anti-clerical lawyer and notary, a man of structure, rigidity, the law. He had very high expectations and, frankly, very little patience for his son's growing eccentricity.
But the counterbalance to that was his mother, Felipa Domènech Ferres. She was his early champion, his emotional shelter. She was the one who actively encouraged his earliest artistic endeavors.
And the sources make it clear that without her support, the young Dalí might never have had the space to cultivate that intense early self-regard.
That supportive presence was violently ripped away in early 1921 when Dalí was only 16.
His mother died from uterine cancer. He later described this event as the greatest blow I had experienced in my life, saying he worshipped her and relied on her to make invisible the unavoidable blemishes of my soul.
And it adds another layer of complexity to the family dynamic when you consider what followed. His father eventually married his own sister-in-law, Dalí's aunt.
Which might sound like a recipe for resentment. But Dalí himself publicly professed great love and respect for his aunt. He apparently didn't harbor any resentment over the marriage, which shows a willingness, even early on, to accept these complex, contradictory family situations.
And while his later life was filled with capes and theatrical madness, it's worth noting the sort of mundane, grounded details of his youth.
Right. He spent holidays in the Catalan resort town of Cadaqués, and his childhood friends included some serious athletes, future FC Barcelona footballers, Emili Sagui Barba and Josep Samitier. The trio actually played football together.
It's almost impossible to reconcile that image, the mustachioed eccentric with a boy playing football. But these early moments in Catalonia were vital. After this regional crucible, though, the focus shifts. We see Dalí entering the intellectual heart of Spain.
In 1922, he moves to Madrid to study at the Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando, lodging at the famous Residencia de Estudiantes. And he wasn't there long before he distinguished himself, not just academically, but socially.
Oh, he established himself as the ultimate eccentric dandy. He embraced the style of late 19th century English aesthetes, long hair, carefully cultivated sideburns, stockings, knee breeches.
He demanded attention.
And he got it immediately.
The Real Academia, however, couldn't contain him. He was famously expelled twice. First for inciting student protests in 1923 and then permanently in 1926. But the critical development of this period wasn't the formal education. It was the intellectual companionship.
Exactly. The Residencia was a magnet for the nation's young avant-garde. He formed these deep and mutually influential connections with the filmmaker Luis Buñuel and, most intensely, with the poet Federico Garcia Lorca.
That friendship with Lorca was just. It was emotionally intense, passionate, deeply complex. Dalí himself later claimed he rejected Lorca's sexual advances, but the emotional investment was undeniable and foundational to both of their work.
And that relationship, full of intellectual electricity and artistic collaboration, tragically lasted until Lorca's execution by nationalist forces in the early days of the Spanish Civil War in 1936.
So while he's busy shocking his peers with his appearance and his social life, Dalí was also intensely studying the history of art.
Yes, his exposure to the ultra group introduced him to radical movements like Dada and Futurism. You can see that influence in early Cubist-inspired works like Cabaret Scene from 1922.
But here's where that critical duality emerges again. At the same time, he undertook what he called a monk-like period. Every Sunday morning, he's at the Prado Museum, analyzing and studying the old masters Velázquez, Goya, El Greco with this intense dedication. He revered classical technique.
And this grounding in realism is so important. When you look at his later surrealist works, it's easy to miss that the reason the impossible landscapes feel so real is because they are executed with the technical precision of a Renaissance master.
You see this mastery of realism powerfully in The Basket of Bread from 1926. It's an astonishingly precise, traditional still life painted just before he fully embraced the surrealist tide.
In April 1926, he makes his crucial first trip to Paris. He meets Picasso, whom he revered, and Picasso showed great interest in the young Catalan's work.
And his fellow Catalan, Joan Miró, then introduces him to the wider circle of surrealists, who were immediately captivated by his talent.
By 1927, his transition to his mature style was well underway. The work became saturated with dreamlike images and that idiosyncratic iconography we know so well. But the precise draftsmanship was always there, lending this undeniable, almost photographic credibility to the most impossible subject matter.
Honey is Sweeter Than Blood from 1927 is a great example of this, poised right between Cubism's flatness and Surrealism's depth.
And the foundational intellectual framework for this explosion of new work came directly from his intensive reading of two key figures, Sigmund Freud and the 19th century poet Comte de Lautremont.
Dalí instantly and profoundly incorporated the Freudian themes dreams, the subconscious suggestive sexual imagery, into his output.
And just as instantly, the controversy began. In 1928, he submitted a work called Dialogue on the Beach, Unsatisfied Desires, to the Barcelona Autumn Salon.
And the organizing committee rejected it outright.
They said it was not fit to be exhibited in any gallery habitually visited by the numerous public, little prepared for certain surprises.
Which was a media scandal, and Dalí, the young artist, just eager for fame, must have loved every single minute of it.
It confirmed for him that his art, by challenging social boundaries and demanding a reaction, held immense power. He realized provocation was a core tool in his artistic arsenal.
If the 1920s were about gestation, then 1929 was the year of explosive birth. This single year stands as the most transformative period in Dalí's entire life. It reshaped everything, both his art and his personal foundation.
Professionally, 1929 delivered Un Chien d'Alun and Delusion Dog, his collaboration with Luis Buñuel.
That 17-minute short film remains a canonical piece of cinema. It's famous for its shocking imagery, from the eyeball being slashed, which is still difficult to watch today,
Oh, it's impossible to watch,
to the appearance of the famous rotting donkeys on pianos. The film's brilliance lies in its deliberate, irrational discontinuity.
And the script was reportedly written by Dalí and Buñuel, agreeing to use only images that meant nothing, images drawn from their dreams that made no logical sense. It was a violent assault on bourgeois intellectual and artistic conventions.
Pure Dadaist shock therapy applied to the cinema.
And personally, 1929 delivered Gala. Elena Ivanovna Diakonova, a Russian immigrant a decade older than him, arrived in his life. She was married to the surrealist poet Paul Eluard at the time.
But the connection with Dalí was instantaneous, passionate, and permanent.
Gala swiftly became everything. His lover, his lifelong muse, and critically, his exceptionally astute business manager. While Dalí was busy being a genius and performing eccentric stunts, Gala was managing the money and the contracts.
And he officially joined the Surrealist group in Paris that same year. They saw him as the movement's savior, a technical master who could depict the chaos of the subconscious with terrifying clarity. And they celebrated his new technique, the paranoid critical method.
Okay, let's slow down here for you because this is the intellectual engine room of his art. What exactly was the paranoid critical method?
It was essentially Dalí's unique, systematic method for accessing his subconscious mind and producing subjective hallucinations, all while retaining his objective observational skills. That's the critical part.
So he would intentionally induce this subjective state of paranoia, a state of delirious interpretation, which allowed him to see multiple, often contradictory images hidden within a single visual form.
Exactly. So instead of the surrealist's primary tool, which was automatism, just scribbling or writing unconsciously, Dalí's method was controlled. It was a hallucinatory state driven by a paranoid delusion, but then rendered with objective academic precision.
It's controlled madness.
Controlled madness. He could paint one thing, like a woman gazing out to sea. But through the paranoid lens, he saw that same composition resolve itself into the face of his father, or a lion, or a telephone. This method is the direct reason we see so many double images and optical illusions in his work.
But just as he was achieving this artistic integration with the surrealists, his family life shattered.
The rupture with his father was dramatic and final. It was driven by Don Salvador's extreme disapproval of Gala and Dalí's increasingly provocative art and statements.
The final violent breaking point came over a provocative inscription Dalí added to a drawing of the Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ, which was widely published.
The inscription was about spitting on his deceased mother's portrait. Don Salvador, already furious about Gala, demanded a public recantation.
Dalí refused, and the result was a dramatic expulsion from the paternal home and disinheritance in December 1929. For Dalí, embracing this shocking public persona meant he had to sever ties with the strict patriarchal world of Figueres.
After the break, he and Gala immediately relocated to the nearby coast, renting and eventually buying a small, humble fisherman's cabin in Port Legat.
And over the next few decades, they bought the neighboring cabins and gradually enlarged the structure into the eccentric, sprawling seaside villa that became his spiritual home and his primary workshop for decades.
It was in this environment, this new life with Gala, that he produced his defining masterpiece, The Persistence of Memory, painted in 1931. Those melting watches cemented his fame instantly.
What's so fascinating about this work is the story of its creation. Dalí claimed the idea for the soft, melting texture of the watches. Symbolizing the rejection of time as rigid and deterministic came to him quite literally when he was contemplating a piece of Camembert cheese on a warm August evening.
I love that origin story, the sublime coming from the completely mundane.
It's not just the limp watches, though. You have to look at the context. The wide, stark, desolate Catalan landscape, the watches being devoured by ants, another common Dalínian symbol of decay and desire.
And that amorphous, slightly monstrous self-portrait draped across the foreground. It's a total vision of relative time and internal psychological collapse, but it's rendered in this hyper-real detail.
As his painting technique soared, so did his flair for the dramatic spectacle. His public persona rapidly transformed into a living, breathing extension of his artwork.
The famous London International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936 is the ultimate illustration of this.
Oh, yes. Dalí arrived to deliver a lecture titled Fantômes Paranoïaques Authentiques, Authentic Paranoid Ghosts, while wearing a complete, antiquated deep-sea diving suit and helmet.
He had to be escorted in, carrying a billiard cue and flanked by 2 Russian wolfhounds. And as he began his address, he started gasping, and they had to physically unscrew him from the heavy metal helmet because he was suffocating.
And his explanation, he just said he wanted to show that he was plunging deeply into the human mind.
This was theater of the absurd, at its absolute peak. He was forcing the audience to experience the difficulty and the potential danger inherent in the Surrealist project.
This phase also saw his creation of some of the most enduring three-dimensional objects in the Surrealist canon, largely thanks to the patronage of the wealthy English poet Edward James, who began supporting Dalí in 1936.
And that's where we get the icons of applied surrealism, the lobster telephone and the Mae West Lip sofa.
The telephone and the lobster held intense sexual connotations for Dalí, representing the conflation of the edible and the erotic. It was a subversive, functional object.
James actually bought 4 of those functional lobster telephones and installed them in his home. The sofa, of course, was shaped precisely after the distinctive, sensuous lips of the American actress Mae West.
Dalí's drive to create these surrealist objects was meant to subvert conventional reality. Other notable pieces included retrospective bust of a woman from 1933 and, perhaps most famously, the Rainy Taxi from 1938.
The Rainy Taxi featured a real automobile with 2 mannequin occupants. The bizarre twist was that water poured constantly inside the taxi, soaking the occupants, making the absurd visible and physical. It was pure spectacle designed to disrupt expectations.
And finally, in 1938, he achieved a psychological landmark, meeting Sigmund Freud.
The meeting was arranged in London by the writer Stefan Zweig. Dalí, who considered Freud a virtual intellectual father figure, was ecstatic.
As Dalí sketched his portrait, Freud reportedly whispered, "That boy looks like a fanatic."
And Dalí was delighted by the description. Freud, who had previously dismissed surrealists as complete fools, was forced to reconsider.
Freud later wrote to Zweig that he was impressed by Dalí's candid, fanatical eyes and his undeniable technical mastery, acknowledging that the young Spaniard had changed his estimate of the entire movement.
It's an incredible moment. The scientific pioneer of the subconscious admitting he was impressed by the man who made the subconscious visible.
The outbreak of World War II in Europe forced a massive geographical and thematic shift in Dalí's career. Following the German invasion of France, Dalí and Gala escaped to Portugal. They sailed to New York in August 1940.
And they spent the next 8 years deeply immersed in American culture, dividing their time between New York and California. This period was pivotal, not just artistically, but commercially.
His reputation just soared. The Museum of Modern Art in New York held a major retrospective of his work from 1941 to 1942, which then toured 8 American cities. That cemented his position as the most famous living modern artist in the world.
His fame was further solidified in 1942 with the publication of his autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dalí. The book was a sensation, widely praised. Time magazine called it one of the most irresistible books of the year.
It was the book that meticulously crafted his public image as both genius and eccentric, although it later drew fire from critics like George Orwell, who skewered its intense self-regard.
But artistically, a major ideological break was brewing. In 1941, Dalí dramatically announced the death of Surrealism. He declared a bold return to classicism, prioritizing form, control, structure, and specifically the use of the golden section in his composition.
Wait, can you elaborate on the golden section? That mathematical shift seems critical to his intellectual break from pure dream logic.
Absolutely. The golden section, or divine proportion, is an irrational mathematical ratio, approximately 1.618, that has fascinated artists and mathematicians since ancient Greece. It's often found in nature, and Renaissance artists used it because they believed it created the most aesthetically pleasing, harmonious compositions.
So for Dalí, this return to the golden section signaled his rejection of the randomness of surrealist automatism.
Exactly. He wanted to impose divine, objective order onto his subjective, chaotic dream content.
So he wasn't just walking away quietly, he was actively attacking his former movement. In a catalog essay for a 1943 exhibition, he claimed that Surrealism's core method of automatism had failed and led to total sterility. He even dismissed the use of collage as lazy and uninspired.
This profound ideological separation solidified his permanent split with André Breton, the theoretical leader of Surrealism. And Breton, witnessing Dalí's increasing commercial success and obsession with money, retaliated in 1949 with that devastating, unforgettable anagram, Avida dollars.
Avid for dollars. It's brilliant, simple, and utterly damning. That nickname stuck, and it encapsulated the resentment among his former peers. He became the definition of an artist who sold out his original movement for fame and fortune.
And Dalí, ever the provocateur, just embraced it. He became a true multimedia artist during this period. He created elaborate designs for ballets, including Labyrinth in 1942 and Mad Tristan in 1944.
His film work reached an enormous new audience. In 1945, he created the famous groundbreaking dream sequence for Alfred Hitchcock's psychological thriller Spellbound.
And while it was later edited down and neither Dalí nor Hitchcock was entirely satisfied with the final result, that segment brought Dalí's distinct visual style to millions of mainstream viewers.
And even more surprising, perhaps, was his 1946 collaboration with Walt Disney and animator John Hench on the animated film Destino.
The project was visually stunning, but ultimately abandoned due to financial constraints. It was only rediscovered and completed decades later in 2003, but it shows Dalí's willingness to operate across every possible artistic boundary, from high art to commercial animation.
He dove headfirst into product design, cementing that Avida dollar's reputation by producing artwork and designs for everything from cosmetics and perfumes to hosiery and neckties. He understood the power of brand and spectacle perhaps better than any artist of his generation.
But while he was navigating the commercial world, an immense global event was reshaping his artistic focus: the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945.
Right, and this ushered in another crucial thematic shift. His work began to reflect the trauma and the wonder of the atomic age, leading to what he called nuclear mysticism.
This shift wasn't just aesthetic, it was intellectual. His paintings started incorporating the geometry of the atom. We see this in works like Atomic and Uranian Melancholic Ideal and the preparatory studies for Lita Atomica.
In the case of Lita Atomica, the structure wasn't arbitrary. The sources confirmed that Dalí meticulously calculated the work's proportions in collaboration with a mathematician.
And he created a composition where every element, the swan, Lita, the pedestal, is suspended and levitating, never touching, symbolizing the atomic forces that hold matter together. But this meticulous synthesis of Einsteinian physics, classicism, and Catholic mysticism was the new intellectual core of Dalí's output.
To really grasp Dalí's artistic language, especially in this post-surrealist phase, we need a shortcut into his thematic symbolism. He uses a stable, recurring, and often bizarre lexicon throughout his entire career.
Let's start with food, which, for Dalí, was profoundly linked to beauty and sex.
Yeah.
Bread, in particular, was revered. It represented the elementary basis of continuity and sacred subsistence.
He even once gave a lecture at the Sorbonne using a 12-meter-long baguette as a physical prop to illustrate a point about continuity.
Then there are eggs. They're ubiquitous in his work. The iconic sculptures atop his Portlegate home and his museum in figures. He connected the egg to prenatal and intrauterine life, representing hope and love. It's a very positive, if slightly strange, symbol.
It contrasts sharply with some of his other imagery.
Definitely. And let's not forget the sea urchin. Dalí was fascinated by its radial symmetry and loved eating them with his father. He used this motif because its structure represents a kind of natural divine geometry, connecting back to his obsession with the golden section.
The animals often take us to a darker, more visceral place. Rotting donkeys and the appearance of ants are typically markers of death, decay, and violent sexual desire.
And the snail is a fascinating case study in Freudian transfer. He connected the snail to the human head, specifically because he saw one crawling on a bicycle outside Freud's house when they met.
So for Dalí, that mundane observation instantly became charged with psychoanalytic significance. And of course, locusts represent pure fear and waste for him.
Then there's the rhinoceros, which truly dominated his iconography from the mid-1950s onward. This is peak Dalí, merging the absurd with the scientific.
He was obsessed with the rhinoceros horn because, he claimed, it grows in a perfect logarithmic spiral, that same natural geometric progression he saw in the golden section. He saw the rhinoceros as signifying divine geometry.
And he paradoxically linked the animal to chastity and the purity of the Virgin Mary, yet simultaneously used its horn as an overtly explicit phallic symbol in works like Young Virgin auto-sodomized by the horns of her own chastity.
It's a spectacular example of Dalí synthesizing completely opposing ideas.
And this leads us directly back to the science connection, the true aha moment of his later career. The man who saw Freud as his intellectual father later declared in his 1958 Antimatter Manifesto, "My father today is Dr. Heisenberg."
That statement marks his total intellectual pivot from the subjective landscape of psychoanalysis to the objective, fragmented world of quantum mechanics and physics.
He visually explored this shift in works like The Disintegration of the Persistence of Memory from 1954.
In that painting, he takes his own 1931 masterpiece and shows the landscape and the soft watches fracturing into molecular segments and shards, all just hovering in space.
This visual dissolution of classical material reality is widely interpreted as a direct reference to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the breakdown of certainty in the atomic age.
And his scientific fascination extended into geometry. He was deeply interested in the tesseract, or the four-dimensional cube. He used this concept to structure his magnificent 1954 work, Crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus.
Right, so for you listening, what exactly is a tesseract and why did he need it for a crucifixion painting?
Well, a tesseract is essentially the four-dimensional equivalent of a cube. We can't physically see it, but we can represent its projection in 3 dimensions.
And Dalí used it because he was trying to depict a divine, non-material body, Christ's resurrected body, in a way that transcended human 3-dimensional space. The cross in the painting is formed not of wood, but of the unfolded projection of a hypercube.
Making the moment of crucifixion an act of divine spatial mathematics. It was a visual attempt to explain a theological mystery using cutting-edge physics.
That incredible commitment to geometric and spatial novelty is everywhere in his work. He was a genuine pioneer in utilizing optical effects long before they became commonplace. He used double images, where a single canvas can be interpreted as 2 different scenes, anamorphosis, negative space extensively.
He even installed a glass floor in a room near his Port Leggett studio so he could study the effects of foreshortening from both above and below, incorporating these dramatic, dizzying perspectives into his canvases.
And critically, he was among the first artists to employ holography, experimenting with it in the late 1960s to create 3-dimensional light projections.
His versatility extended far beyond fine art. Dalí made significant, often whimsical contributions to mass culture design and objects.
The jewelry he created is extraordinary. He produced 39 intricate pieces between 1941 and 1970. The most famous is the Royal Heart, an extravagant piece made of gold, rubies, diamonds, and emeralds.
And it was designed with such intricacy that the center is motorized and actually beats rhythmically like a human heart.
And on a completely different end of the commercial spectrum, his most recognized design legacy is something you see everywhere. The simple, iconic Chupa Chups logo, which he designed in 1969.
In high fashion, he was a defining collaborator. He worked extensively with the legendary Surrealist designer Elsa Schiaparelli in the 1930s, producing famous designs like the white dress featuring a printed red lobster.
And the utterly bizarre shoe-shaped hat.
Later, in 1950, he collaborated with Christian Dior on a specialized, imaginative piece he called A Costume for the Year 2045.
And his film legacy, beyond the American projects, is foundational. Un Chien Andalou and the later, more politically charged L'Âge d'Or are cinematic landmarks. L'Âge d'Or, in fact, was so provocative that it was banned after right-wing groups staged a riot in the Parisian theater where it was being shown.
Dalí's imagination was truly boundless, even for projects that never saw the light of day. Can you imagine the film Giraffes on Horseback Salad? It was a scenario he wrote in 1937 specifically for Harpo Marx.
The title alone tells you everything about the chaos within.
He also had a significant late-career collaboration with director José Montes Baker on the pseudo-documentary Impressions of Upper Mongolia in 1975, where Dalí narrates a wholly fictitious expedition in search of giant hallucinogenic mushrooms.
And we can't forget his Earl of Theater design work, creating the scenery for Federico Garcia Lorca's 1927 play Mariana Pineda, proving his stagecraft was active long before his cinematic breakthroughs.
We must now address the most challenging and controversial aspect of Dalí's later life, his politics. Following his return to his native Catalonia in 1948, Dalí made the conscious, shocking decision to publicly align himself with the authoritarian Franco regime.
This decision was met with immediate and massive outrage from the anti-Francoist artistic and intellectual community across the globe. We have sources detailing just how incensed people were. Pablo Picasso, for instance.
A towering figure in modern art.
Right. He was so furious about Dalí's support for the regime that he reportedly refused to ever mention Dalí's name or acknowledge his existence again.
And Dalí solidified this stance through multiple official meetings with General Franco, including in 1956, 1968, and 1974. His views were consistently reactionary and seemed designed to shock.
In 1968, he stated that upon Franco's death, there should be no return to democracy, arguing instead that Spain should immediately become an absolute monarchy.
The public outcry reached a critical peak in 1975. Dalí publicly supported Franco's decision to execute 3 alleged Basque terrorists. He didn't just quietly support the regime, he doubled down on his contrarianism, declaring, "Personally, I'm against freedom, I'm for the Holy Inquisition."
That is an astonishing quote, especially coming from a former anarchist youth who just spent decades depicting the disintegration of reality. Unsurprisingly, this statement led to him receiving death threats and prompted his temporary flight to New York.
What's fascinating, though, is the inherent paradox even in his politics. When King Juan Carlos visited the ailing artist in 1981, Dalí told him, "I have always been an anarchist and a monarchist."
Which suggests that perhaps even his most extreme political pronouncements were less about deep-seated fascist ideology and more about cultivating a persona of extreme, shocking, and ultimately self-serving contrarianism. He simply had to be against whatever the rest of the art world supported.
This political conservatism coincided with a resurgence of religious fervor. Upon returning to Spain, he announced his return to the Catholic faith, meeting with Pope Pius XII and later Pope John XXIII.
And this confluence of physics, extreme classicism with a golden section, and renewed Catholic faith fueled that nuclear mysticism phase. He sought to synthesize traditional Christian iconography with images of atomic disintegration and scientific structure.
Key works from this period that illustrate this unique fusion include The Christ of St. John of the Cross from 1951 and the massive The Ecumenical Council from 1960.
Throughout these later years, you can't lose sight of the enduring power of his public persona. The spectacle, the performance art was constant and often overshadowed the immense technical quality of his canvases.
Even critics who despised his politics consistently acknowledged his serious technical skill.
And the anecdotes confirming his carefully engineered persona are just endless. Consider 1955. He delivered a lecture at the Sorbonne, arriving not just in a Rolls-Royce, but in one entirely filled with cauliflowers, spilling out the windows.
Or his appearance on the Dick Cavett Show in 1970, where he carried his pet anteater. He also famously traveled frequently with his pet ocelot, Babu, even aboard luxury ocean liners, turning every public event into a Dalí-centric circus.
He perfectly encapsulated this relentless self-promotion in one of his most famous boasts, stating that, "Every morning upon awakening, I experience a supreme pleasure, that of being Salvador Dalí." He knew his own genius, and he was determined to market it as aggressively as any corporation.
And through all the chaos, the one constant was Gala. She wasn't just his muse. She was the indispensable force that kept the whole performance afloat. She was his exceptionally adept business manager, diligently ensuring their notoriously extravagant lifestyle was funded.
Their relationship lasted over 50 years, defined by many accounts as tense, complex, and ambiguous. It survived Dalí's voyeurism, his flirtations, and Gala's own extramarital affairs, which Dalí seemed to tolerate.
It seems like he understood her independence as a necessary element of their dynamic.
And a striking example of the complexity of their relationship came in 1968. Dalí purchased the castle of Pujol for Gala, but subject to one incredible condition. He agreed not to visit without her prior written permission.
That arrangement speaks volumes about the shifting power dynamics and the need for separate spaces within their shared existence.
Sadly, the final decade of his life was marked by severe decline. Starting around 1980, his health deteriorated sharply. He suffered from profound depression and Parkinson-like symptoms, which included a severe tremor in his right arm.
Devastating for an artist who relied so heavily on precise draftsmanship.
And there were serious, though often disputed, allegations that in his declining state, Gala was supplying him with pharmaceuticals from her own prescriptions. This dark period lasted until Gala's death in June 1982 at age 87.
Following her death, Dalí was devastated. He relocated to the castle in Pujol, where she was entombed. It was during this period that King Juan Carlos bestowed upon him the title of Marqués de Dalí de Pujol, recognizing his status as an unparalleled national treasure despite the political controversy.
In May 1983, Dalí revealed what he claimed was his last canvas, The Swallow's Tail. The work was heavily influenced by René Thom's complex mathematical catastrophe theory.
However, critics immediately noted the visible imprecision in the brushwork, questioning the execution given the severe tremor afflicting his painting arm.
And this was compounded by the notorious forgery scandal of his late career. There are persistent and serious allegations that in his final, highly dependent state, guardians or associates forced Dalí to sign thousands of blank canvases and lithograph paper.
The estimates suggest possibly 50,000 such sheets were signed from 1965 until his death,
which has hopelessly confused and muddied the late graphic art market, making dealers extremely wary of works from that period.
Dalí died on January 23, 1989, at the age of 84 from cardiac arrest. Ever the showman, he had made one final public appearance in 1986 after having a pacemaker implanted, declaring, "When you are a genius, you do not have the right to die, because we are necessary for the progress of humanity."
He executed his own final magnificent performance by being buried in the crypt directly beneath the stage of his self-designed Dalí Theater Museum in Figures, right across the street from the church where he was baptized and had his funeral. He chose to make his final resting place the very monument to his own genius.
And even death couldn't stop the drama. In 2017, the sources reveal a judge ordered his exhumation for a paternity suit.
Right. His DNA was extracted, and tests conclusively proved he was not the father of the claimant. But the most incredible detail from the exhumation was confirmation that his iconic mustache, perfectly preserved by the embalming process, was still intact, proudly pointing toward the sky.
Despite all the commercialism, the scandal, and the political choices, his impact remains massive. Dalí is noted as a major influence on pop art artists like Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst, who took his blending of fine art and commercial packaging to new extremes.
His aesthetic permeates contemporary culture. The iconic masks worn by the anti-heroes in the Spanish television series Money Heist, for instance, are Dalí masks.
And they were chosen precisely because he is recognized globally as the ultimate symbol of Spanish genius and eccentric rebellion.
His legacy is commemorated globally, not only through the two major museums, the Dalí Theater Museum in Spain and the Salvador Dalí Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, but also by geography itself. His name is stamped on the Salvador Dalí Desert in Bolivia and, incredibly, on the Dalí crater on the planet Mercury, a truly enduring cosmic legacy.
Looking back across the entire stack of source material we synthesized for you today, the essential takeaway of Salvador Dalí is the monumental paradox he embodied. He was the master technician who was expelled from the academy for his arrogance,
The surrealist pioneer who was kicked out of the group for being too focused on commerce.
the political anarchist youth who became a Francoist monarchist.
He was a visual voyeur who immortalized his older Russian muse, a man who was fascinated equally by the dream logic of Freud and the quantum physics of Heisenberg. His sprawling multi-decade career demonstrates perfectly how artistic genius can and often must coexist with calculated commercial spectacle and the most intense public provocation.
The profound internal conflicts he experienced over his sexuality, his faith, his identity, ultimately became the chaotic, fertile fuel for his most masterful and memorable works.
So we leave you with this final provocative thought, something to really mull over as you reconsider his body of work in his life.
Dalí spent the better part of 5 decades meticulously, exhaustively crafting his public persona, the mustache, the quotes, the theatrical stunts, all to ensure at every turn that the world viewed him as an undeniable, singular genius.
So if a genius must constantly and outrageously declare himself a genius to maintain his status, does that constant lifelong performance, the life of Salvador Dalí itself, ultimately become the greatest, most enduring, and most complex piece of performance art he ever created?
The art of being Dalí, perhaps, surpassing the very paintings he desperately tried to protect from his own self-destructive commercial impulses.